so hey, I made a little mistake. I messed up the order of that. And so let me kind of run you through what all we covered in the book of Jonah just now. And so it starts off with God giving Jonah this message that he is supposed to go to Nineveh and talk to the Ninevites and tell them that they need to turn from their ways, that they need to turn from their wicked ways, or God is going to destroy their city. Right? And Jonah hears this and is like, nah, I'm good, fam. I'm going to go actually the complete opposite direction, and I'm going to run away. And so Jonah gets on a boat and starts going as far away as he can from Nineveh. Right? And then the storm comes on the sea, and it's because Jonah is trying to flee the presence of God, is trying to run away from the calling that God has put on his life to bring this message to the Ninevites. And so they eventually throw Jonah overboard, and he is eaten by a whale like you just saw with the 7th and 8th grade ladies. And for 3 days and 3 nights, Jonah is in the belly of the whale, and he prays, and finally he is spit up on dry land, like that beautiful throw up you saw thrown into the crowd. That was awesome. And so Jonah is now on dry land, and at the beginning of the guys' skit, you saw them when God gave Jonah the message again. He says, Jonah, go to the Ninevites and tell them this message that I have given you. And so we're going to get into the rest of the story, but I want to press pause right there. And I just want to have a conversation about how this relates to our life today, how this relates to our faith today. Because I don't know about you, but I haven't been swallowed by a whale in like a really long time, okay? Like that's not stuff that you see every day, right? So how does this story of Jonah being swallowed by a whale relate to us? Right? You see, God gave Jonah this message to bring to the people around him. And just like Jonah, God has given us a message to bring to the people around us. Right? Like if you're a Christian in this room, God has given you a message in the Great Commission. He has told you that you need to go and make disciples of all nations. And you need to go and tell the people around you about Him, about Jesus. And so often, just like Jonah ran away from that calling on his life, and he said, no, I'm not going to do that, God. So often we find ourselves in the same exact boat, saying no to that calling that God has put on our life. And so I just want to ask you, like, before we jump in, when was the last time that you had a conversation with someone about Jesus? Or when was the last time that you talked to someone who wasn't a Christian and you shared your faith with them? You actually just brought up Jesus and talked to them about God and talked to them about church. Or when was the last time that you went up to one of your friends who you knew wasn't a Christian and you invited them to Radiate? Right? Like just like Jonah, we find ourselves running from this calling that God has put on our lives too. And so I want to talk about 2 things today that kind of hold us back from sharing our faith, that hold us back from fulfilling that purpose and that message that God has given us. What are the 2 main things that I see that hold us back, and how do we see those play out in the story of Jonah? And so the first thing that I see is fear of not knowing. Fear of not knowing. This is one that I get. Like, truthfully, I understand this, and I hear so many of you telling me you struggle with this, with the thought of, well, what if I don't have all the answers? What if I try to talk to someone about Jesus, and they start asking all these questions that I don't have answers to? Or worse yet, what if someone tries to start arguing with me or debating me, and I don't know what to say? Like, I don't have the answers for what they're saying. Fear of not thinking that we have enough knowledge is something huge that holds us back from sharing our faith. And so I love what happens in Jonah as Jonah brings this message to the Ninevites in chapter 3, verses 3 through 5. It says, Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God, a fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. I don't want you to skip over what just happened here. I don't want you to skip over what Jonah just did. Jonah simply went into this city and repeated 8 words. Just 8 simple words that he went and he repeated over in this city. He says, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Just 8 simple words and this whole city is saved. We can get so in our heads about how, well, I don't know all the answers. What if I don't have an answer for their questions? What if I'm not able to just spout off all this knowledge that I have about the Bible and about God? But we see in this story that it was so simple. Like Jonah just said 8 words and God used that to save a whole city. Right? Like, I want you to understand this. That God has called you right now to make disciples. God has called you right now to make disciples. Like, God has not called the smarter version of you to make disciples. God has not called the more educated you to make disciples. God has not called the you who knows the Bible better to make disciples. God has called you right now in your current standing to make disciples. All right? And you got to believe that if He has called you to do that, and you go out in faith and you do that He is going to bless it. That there are people that are going to come to know the name of Jesus if you would just go like Jonah did. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have it all together, but you just got to be willing to go. I think that can hold us back so often. Just thinking that we don't have all the answers. We don't know enough to share our faith. Man, if Jesus has done something in your life, then you have enough to share with someone. You just simply point back to your own life and say, I don't know all the answers. I don't have this all figured out, but I know that I'm not the same person that I used to be. I know that God has done something in my heart, and He wants to do something in your heart too. He wants to change your life too. It's that simple. We just not overcomplicate the message. The gospel is a simple message, and God has called you right now to go share it. Not the smarter you, not the more educated you. And so I think the first problem we run into is we're just afraid that we don't have all the answers. We won't know as much as we need to know. And second, we're afraid of how people will respond. We're afraid of how people will respond when we share the gospel with them. I mean, what if people look at me differently? What if people start making fun of me or labeling me as that Jesus freak? Like, I just don't want that label. I don't want people to view me in a different way. I don't want to be made fun of. I don't want people to look at me differently because I share my faith. And I want to give you some background on the Ninevites here. Because Jonah doesn't talk a whole lot about it, but you see if you look in other places, it's all over Greek literature, ancient Greek literature, how the Ninevites were these evil, evil, wicked people. In other places, other than the Bible, it describes the Ninevites as these wicked, evil people. They were known for murdering people, for skinning people alive, for abusing young children and women. I mean, like, these people were terrorists, truly. These are not good people, and recognize that God gives Jonah a pretty straightforward message to bring to them. I mean, he's basically saying, hey, your city is going to be destroyed if you don't stop living the way that you're doing. I mean, there's not a whole lot of sweet talk. There's not a whole lot of beating around the bush going on in that message. Like, if I'm Jonah in that situation, I'm thinking, well, what if they skin me alive? You know? What if they murder me? I would be a little afraid of how they would respond in that situation, knowing who these people are. But Jonah goes. I mean, he didn't really have a choice after he got spit out of the whale onto dry land, but I guess he could have turned around and been like, I'm getting back in the whale's stomach and I'm leaving. Right? But he goes and he talks to the Ninevites and he brings this message to them, and what happens? Every single one of them gets saved. God saves the whole city. Right? So here's my challenge to you. And here's my question to you. Are you more concerned about what God thinks about you? Or are you more concerned about what the people at your school think about you? Are you more concerned about this commandment that God has given you to go and make disciples of all nations? To go and tell people about Jesus? Or are you more concerned about what the people around you are going to think about you? What they're going to label you as? Would we just be a youth group that throws that to the side and says, God, I fear you. I care about your opinion more than anyone else about me. And so I'm going to go and proclaim this message. I love, Paul says it like this in Romans chapter 1, verse 16. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. First to the Jew, then to the Gentile. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Why, Paul? Why are you not ashamed of the gospel? Because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Think about that for a minute. Can we just let the fact that people could possibly go from an eternity in hell to an eternity in heaven with Jesus? Would that just be more important than what people are going to think about us when we share the message? I'll never forget. I can't take credit for this. I heard this while I was in college from their pastor on staff, Liz Brantley. When I was infused in college ministry, she shared this, and it just so touched me. Right? The last thing that I want, the very last thing that I want, is to be standing before the gates of heaven one day, awaiting judgment, awaiting to go into heaven, right? And I see that person who sat next to me in math class. I see that person who was on my sports team. I know God. I remember him telling me, hey, go talk to that person. Go invite them to Radiate. Go tell them what I've done in your life. Go have a conversation with them. And when I said no, I said, God, no, I'm not willing to go. It's going to be awkward. It's going to be weird. What if I don't have all the answers? What if they look at me differently? I'm saying no. What if you see them and they look over at you and they're like, you knew? You knew that God existed? You knew that I was going to have an eternity in hell separated from Him, and you didn't say anything to me? And what excuse are we going to have at that point? What excuse are we going to have? Well, I was just nervous that you were going to ask a question and I wasn't going to quite know the answer to. Or I was just nervous that you were going to look at me a little differently. My challenge to you tonight, before we break out into breakout groups, it's would we just let the gospel that has the power to bring people from death to life, has the power to save people from an eternity in hell, would we let that be more powerful than what people think about us? Would we let that have more power over our lives than what the people around us think about us? That's my challenge to you guys. So I'm going to dismiss you into breakouts, and so let me pray.